the country whose title I've been so greatly privileged to bear during so much of my life and duty.
It was not one more royal headline. It was the kind of moment that changes the course of a monarchy forever. When Prince William finally addressed King Charles's unexpected departure from active royal duties, his words carried far more than tradition. They reflected heartbreak, responsibility, and the reality that a new chapter had already begun. Behind the palace walls, a son was no longer simply supporting his father, he was preparing to lead. Before we continue, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the latest royal updates. William understood that the nation expected calm and confidence, but simple reassurance could no longer hide the truth. Holding a neatly folded statement in his hands, he paused for a brief moment before speaking. Those few seconds felt unusually heavy, as though the entire institution of the monarchy had stopped to listen. Then William delivered a carefully recorded palace address that confirmed what many had quietly feared. King Charles would step back from active royal responsibilities after doctors concluded that his cancer could no longer be cured. Active royal duties include the daily constitutional work of the monarch, official meetings, approving state business, public engagements, and the responsibilities that keep the crown functioning. This was not a temporary break or a short period of recovery. It marked a lasting withdrawal from the demanding role Charles had spent his entire life preparing to fulfill. From a private room, Charles listened to the announcement in silence. One hand rested on the arm of his chair, while the weight of the moment settled around him. After waiting decades to become king, he now faced the painful reality of watching those responsibilities slowly pass to someone else while he was still alive to witness it. The hardest part was that no political crisis or public controversy had forced this decision. His own failing health had done what no scandal ever could. As William spoke honestly to the nation, Charles understood why his son had chosen complete transparency. Comforting words could not change reality anymore. Camilla remained silent throughout the announcement. She had already heard several versions of the statement, carefully edited drafts designed to sound gentler and less final. But William believed the public deserved honesty, not softened language. Inside the palace, the phrase, "stepping back," no longer sounded temporary. It felt like the beginning of a farewell. Just outside the room, Catherine waited quietly, already aware that this announcement was only the beginning of a much larger transformation. When the address ended, William slowly stood from his seat. There was no sense of relief on his face. Instead, he carried the expression of someone who had crossed an invisible line and could never return to the life he knew before. Long before the public fully understood the significance of the announcement, those closest to Charles had already begun facing its emotional cost. Every royal crisis eventually reaches the headlines, but its deepest impact is always felt within the family first. Behind this announcement stood a father confronting illness, a son accepting enormous responsibility, a devoted wife watching her husband's life change, and a future queen preparing for a role she never expected to assume so soon. Charles was no longer simply a reigning monarch facing health challenges. William was no longer just the heir waiting for his time. Camilla and Catherine were witnessing the entire structure of the royal family shift before their eyes. Later that day, Charles entered a private family meeting. The atmosphere changed the moment he walked into the room. He paused beside the chair traditionally reserved for the sovereign, a seat that had always represented authority, leadership, and continuity. His eyes met William's. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Yet everyone present understood something that no official statement could fully explain. The transition had already begun. This meeting was never about canceling engagements or adjusting a public schedule. It was about reshaping the daily operation of the monarchy while the king remained alive, fully aware of everything unfolding around him. William stood quietly, but he appeared years older than he had only hours earlier. From childhood, he had been prepared for the responsibilities of kingship. Still, no amount of training could prepare anyone to assume those responsibilities while watching a father battle a terminal illness. An heir is simply the next person in line to the throne. But inside that room, the title no longer felt ceremonial or distant. It felt immediate. It felt real. It felt impossibly heavy. Charles noticed that burden reflected in his son's face. Before feeling pride, he felt regret. He knew William was being asked to shoulder responsibilities far sooner than either of them had ever imagined. Camilla experienced the moment as more than a constitutional transition. It was deeply personal. She had stood beside Charles through years of criticism, public scrutiny, and relentless pressure. Now she was watching the man who had waited his entire life to become king slowly surrender the role he had fought so hard to reach, not because he wanted to, but because illness had left him no other choice. The queen consort kept her voice calm, but her silence carried unmistakable weight. She understood that the monarchy depended on stability, yet she also knew that change could feel painfully unforgiving when it came too quickly. Catherine noticed the strain immediately. In front of the family, William appeared composed, but when no one was watching, the tension in his hands revealed the pressure he was carrying. At last, William broke the silence. In a steady voice, he asked everyone to stop treating the situation as though it were only temporary. The words were quiet, but they landed with undeniable force. Catherine looked toward him with concern, knowing that speaking honestly within the family required even more courage than addressing the nation. Camilla turned to Charles, expecting him to challenge the statement, soften its meaning, or reclaim control of the conversation. Instead, Charles remained still. He stepped toward his chair, paused for a moment, and finally spoke. His voice no longer sounded like that of a king protecting his authority. It sounded like a father asking his son to safeguard what he could no longer carry alone. But this heartbreaking family conversation had not appeared overnight. A single private moment inside the palace had made silence impossible. Long before William's public address, one deeply personal incident forced the royal household to confront reality. It was not based on rumor, speculation, or a passing medical report. It was one event that convinced everyone that time was no longer on their side. From that evening onward, every royal smile, every revised schedule, and every postponed engagement carried a meaning far heavier than the public realized. Charles continued trying to preserve the routine of royal life, even as the responsibilities demanded more from him than he could give. He still requested his daily briefings. He still insisted on reviewing official papers. He still wanted the monarchy to appear steady and uninterrupted. Royal duties include the king's official responsibilities, such as government meetings, ceremonial events, approving state business, and public appearances that symbolize the continuity of the crown. To protect public confidence, palace officials quietly reduced Charles's workload and spread out his engagements. They believed that showing signs of serious weakness too early could raise difficult questions about the future of the reign. William, however, saw what carefully planned schedules could not hide. He watched his father conserve energy before appearances. He noticed his voice growing weaker during lengthy discussions. He saw the hesitation before decisions that had once come effortlessly. Senior palace advisors continued describing the situation as manageable. But William had witnessed his father's private struggles. After that, every carefully chosen reassurance felt less convincing. Camilla also resisted accepting the full reality. She feared that acknowledging the permanence of Charles's condition would mean watching him surrender the crown while he still longed to serve. Then came a private meeting at Windsor following preparations for the annual Commonwealth Service. The Commonwealth Service is a major royal event that brings together representatives from nations connected through the historic Commonwealth. It was expected to be an ordinary rehearsal. Instead, it became a turning point. Charles began speaking to those gathered. Halfway through a sentence, he suddenly stopped. His hand tightened around a silver pen as he struggled to continue. He tried once more to speak. No words came. A moment later, the pen slipped from his hand and struck the table with a sharp sound that echoed through the silent room. No one present ever forgot that moment. Camilla reacted immediately, but William understood what it truly meant before anyone else did. Medical staff quietly escorted Charles from the room. William remained behind. He stood staring at the empty chair, realizing that the palace had entered a stage no carefully written statement could disguise. Later that evening, he was handed a sealed medical report. Inside was the doctor's final assessment, written in direct and unmistakable language. The illness could no longer be cured. Treatment would now focus only on comfort and preserving as much time as possible. William read the report once, then he read it again. The future of his father had been reduced to a few clinical pages. In that moment, his patience finally gave way. Camilla wanted to shield Charles from the harsh truth. Senior advisors urged caution and delay, but William reached a different conclusion. He believed the family deserved complete honesty before anyone else heard it. Once William witnessed that private moment, he could no longer remain the quiet heir waiting patiently in the background. The confrontation did not begin with raised voices. It began with silence. William entered the room not as a challenger or a rival, but as a son carrying a truth no one else was willing to say aloud. Charles already knew why he had come. The king had devoted his entire life to duty, but now that duty demanded something far more painful. It required his son to speak the words he could not bring himself to say. William requested a private meeting with no aides, secretaries, or medical advisors present. A private audience is a confidential meeting with the monarch, away from official staff and public responsibilities. That mattered because, inside that room, no one could hide behind carefully chosen palace language. No one could reduce heartbreak to a line on a schedule. William understood that before the nation heard any announcement, his father deserved to hear the truth directly from him. Charles sat quietly across the table and slowly removed his glasses. He placed them beside an unsigned statement with deliberate care, as though even that small movement carried the weight of an entire reign. The king wanted dignity. He wanted to decide how his time as monarch would be remembered. He hoped to step back on his own terms, not appear as though illness had forced him aside. William wanted something different. He believed honesty had become more important than preserving appearances. The crown represents the monarchy as an institution, but inside that room, it no longer felt like an institution. It felt like a responsibility, being passed from one hurting generation to the next. William's voice nearly faltered as he told his father that protecting the monarchy could no longer mean hiding its reality. Before the meeting, he had personally revised the palace statement. He removed the carefully softened language and replaced it with words he believed the public deserved to hear. He quietly placed the edited draft between them. Charles lowered his eyes and read every correction. In that moment, he realized something had changed. His son was no longer waiting for permission to lead. After a long silence, Charles finally spoke with complete honesty. He admitted he had hoped for more time, not because he feared death itself, but because he feared leaving William to carry the enormous burden alone. He had spent decades preparing to become king, yet nothing had prepared him for watching his son shoulder that responsibility before either of them truly wanted it to happen. Hearing those words, William's determination gave way to heartbreak. For a brief moment, he was no longer thinking as the future king. He was simply a son listening to his father. Charles slowly nodded. It was more than agreement. It was acceptance. With a gentle motion, he pushed the unsigned statement toward William. Then he quietly said, "Tell them as my son, not as my spokesman." William did not answer immediately. He understood the meaning of what had just been entrusted to him. From that moment on, the story was no longer only about a father and a son. It became the story of an entire institution preparing for change. No transition inside the monarchy happens through a single statement. Behind the scenes, the palace quietly began adjusting its daily operations. Official documents were redirected. Private meetings were reorganized. Responsibilities shifted without public attention. Some advisors found themselves taking on larger roles, while others quietly stepped back. Yet amid all those changes, one reality never disappeared. Charles was still alive. He remained fully aware, and he watched, day by day, as more of the authority he had once carried moved into other hands. William recognized the transition before anyone dared describe it openly. He increasingly handled the practical responsibilities of royal leadership, the daily briefings, official schedules, urgent decisions, and responses that kept the monarchy functioning. This was about far more than reducing public appearances. It marked the gradual transfer of the monarchy's working responsibilities while the king was still living through the process himself. Official government papers, traditionally reviewed by the monarch, began reaching William before continuing onward. Inside the palace, everyone understood what that quiet change represented, even if few spoke about it publicly. Catherine's role also became increasingly important. She stood beside William not simply as his wife, but as a source of stability during one of the most difficult periods the family had ever faced. She understood that every appearance, every smile, and every public engagement would quietly reassure the nation that the monarchy remained steady, even while the family behind it struggled with profound personal pain. William relied on her more than he ever admitted in public, and when the meetings ended and the rooms grew quiet, Catherine could see the emotional weight written across his face. The responsibility he had spent a lifetime preparing for had arrived sooner than anyone expected, and it was changing him with every passing day. The authority William was gaining did not feel like a victory. It felt like a burden. With each passing day, another responsibility moved from Charles's household to William's team. Then another, and another. Camilla struggled to accept every new change. One morning, she received an updated palace call sheet, a daily document showing who would oversee meetings, official duties, and key communications. She read it once. Then she read it again. To palace staff, it was simply another administrative update. To Camilla, it felt like the life she had built beside Charles was slowly being dismantled. Later, Charles asked to review one final collection of official papers. The room fell silent. No one wanted to refuse him, but no one wanted to acknowledge why the request carried so much emotion. The king carefully signed the final authorization. He placed the pen down with slow, deliberate movement. As William's aide quietly carried the folder from the room, Charles said nothing. He did not ask for it back, yet everyone noticed his eyes following it until it disappeared beyond the doorway. William never forgot that look. Neither did Catherine. For Camilla, it felt like the closing page of an entire chapter. The new system might protect the monarchy, but that protection came at a deeply personal cost. By the time those papers left the room, the emotional consequences had already begun spreading through the palace. The first heartbreak never reached the public. It happened only after the doors closed, after the aides departed, after duty had spoken louder than emotion. Camilla had stood beside Charles through decades of criticism, public judgment, scandal, and unwavering loyalty. But this moment was unlike anything she had faced before. The crown was not rejecting her. It was quietly moving beyond the life she and Charles had built together. Later, she sat alone. Charles's untouched teacup rested nearby as the sound of a closing door echoed through the corridor. She did not appear angry. She looked deeply alone. The announcement had transformed far more than Charles's reign. It had changed her place within the royal family as well. Charles was no longer simply reducing his public engagements. He was gradually surrendering the authority that had once made every room turn toward him. Constitutional responsibility refers to the monarch's official role in leading the institution of the crown. Personal care is something entirely different. It is the private support offered to a husband, a father, and a man facing illness. The palace was now separating those two roles. For everyone involved, that separation proved more painful than expected. Charles noticed Camilla's silence before anyone else did. He had watched her endure years of public criticism and difficult moments with remarkable resilience. But this silence was different. She had spent years helping him carry the weight of kingship. Now she was watching that weight quietly pass into someone else's hands. Charles wanted to reassure her. He wanted to explain that William was doing only what duty required. He wanted to remind her that the monarchy depended on order. Yet he also understood that order could feel painfully cold when it arrived through closed meetings and transferred responsibilities. At one point, Camilla privately asked a senior palace official whether Charles would still be consulted on important matters. The response came in a carefully prepared household briefing. Every sentence sounded respectful. Every word was chosen with care. But beneath the polished language lay a difficult truth. Charles would continue to receive updates. His opinions would still be valued, but the daily leadership of the monarchy would now pass through William first. Camilla understood exactly what those carefully chosen words meant. Her husband would continue to be respected, but he would no longer stand at the center of daily royal life. Later, Catherine quietly found Camilla sitting alone. She did not offer empty reassurances. She knew some moments could not be softened by kind words. Catherine understood that William's actions were necessary for the future of the monarchy. At the same time, she could clearly see the emotional cost those decisions had placed upon the woman before her. When Camilla finally looked up, there was no rivalry in her eyes, only sadness. Charles felt that sadness even before she spoke. William sensed it as well, but by then, the transition could no longer be delayed. The monarchy had already begun moving forward, and while duty continued, grief quietly filled every space between family and responsibility. Eventually, that grief brought Charles and William to one final private conversation. After the statements had been delivered, after the documents had been signed, after the difficult decisions had been made, the true turning point came behind a closed door, with no advisors, no officials, and no witnesses. No one recorded the conversation. No secretary waited nearby. For one rare moment, there were no royal titles, only a father and his son. For years, the monarchy had demanded strength from both of them. Now it required something even more difficult: trust. William visited Charles privately following the announcement. He had not come to discuss schedules or official duties. He came because he knew that responsibility had left an emotional wound between them, one that no public statement could ever heal. For years, William had been known simply as the heir to the throne, but Charles now understood that his son had crossed beyond that role. William had spoken for the crown. He had delivered the painful truth. He had accepted responsibilities that could never again feel distant or symbolic. The monarchy had found its next leader. But before father and son could move forward, they first needed something even more important. They needed forgiveness. Charles looked at William and saw the emotional weight his son had been carrying long before either of them spoke. The king had heard William's address. He had listened to every carefully chosen word, and beneath the formal language, he recognized something no official statement could hide. His son had spoken not only as the future king, but as a son trying to protect both his father and the monarchy at the same time. William had listened to every word his father spoke. Behind Charles's calm voice, he could hear the pain that no public statement could ever hide. The king understood that William had done what duty demanded, but he also knew that carrying out that duty had made his son feel as though he had betrayed him. At last, William admitted it. Speaking publicly about his father's illness had felt like the hardest thing he had ever done. Even though every word was true, it still felt deeply personal. Charles did not interrupt. He allowed the silence to settle between them. Then William stepped closer, knelt beside his father's chair, and gently took his hand. For the first time that day, there was no king and no heir. Only a father and his son. William no longer tried to sound composed. Charles no longer pretended everything was unchanged. After a quiet pause, the king finally spoke. "The pain wasn't hearing the statement," he said softly. "The pain was realizing you've become strong enough to say it." Those words changed everything. They did not create anger. They did not create resentment. Instead, they opened the door to understanding. Charles then gave William one final piece of advice, one that carried more weight than any official document. Protect the family before you protect the crown. The crown represents the monarchy itself, but Charles wanted his son to remember that no institution, no title, and no tradition could survive if the people carrying them lost their humanity. William quietly made a promise that no official record would ever capture. He promised his father would never be hidden from the public, forgotten by history, or treated as a footnote while the monarchy moved forward. Charles would continue to be honored, he would continue to be seen, and he would always remain respected as both king and father. Charles gently tightened his grip on William's hand. It was more than approval, it was complete trust. While that private promise remained safely within the palace walls, events outside were already moving rapidly. By the following morning, the announcement belonged not only to the royal family, but to the entire nation. Newspapers carried the story, television networks led with it, crowds gathered outside royal residences. Millions reflected on the difficult reality that a king who had waited a lifetime for the throne was now stepping back because of illness. A family's private sorrow had become a national moment. Britain was not simply witnessing a change in royal duties, it was watching the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. William stood beside Catherine as the first public reactions arrived. He accepted the messages with gratitude, but there was no celebration, only quiet responsibility. Soon afterward, the palace released an official schedule confirming that William would immediately assume a greater share of royal leadership while Charles withdrew from active responsibilities. An official schedule outlines the monarchy's planned meetings, ceremonies, public engagements, and constitutional duties. Its release made one thing unmistakably clear. This was no longer only an emotional moment, it was now an institutional transition. The monarchy had already begun adapting to the king's illness. Catherine watched William read the growing number of public messages. She understood that sympathy for Charles also brought enormous expectations for their own family. From that day forward, every public appearance would be closely observed, every smile would be interpreted, every absence would invite questions. William paused when he reached one handwritten letter from a child. The note simply thanked the king for always trying his best. Those few words affected him more than any newspaper headline. He read the letter twice before quietly setting it aside. Outside Buckingham Palace, another powerful scene unfolded. Buckingham Palace, the monarch's official London residence, has long stood as one of the most recognizable symbols of the British monarchy. A silent crowd gathered outside its gates. One newspaper headline read, "The King steps back. William speaks for the crown." Nearby, a woman gently placed a single white rose against the palace railings. Those around her fell silent. No explanation was needed. Everyone understood that history was unfolding before them. Several broadcasters described the announcement as one of the most emotional royal transitions since the final years of Queen Elizabeth II. That comparison carried enormous significance. It reminded the public that moments like these become part of a nation's collective memory. Charles's illness was no longer viewed only as a personal struggle. It had become a defining chapter in the story of the modern monarchy. William understood that the public was not asking for perfection. It was asking for reassurance, for honesty, for hope. Catherine remained by his side. But the final message belonged to William alone. The nation had witnessed the shock. Now it needed to understand what came next. In the end, this story was never only about illness. It was about a king forced to release responsibilities he had spent a lifetime preparing to carry. It was about a son accepting those responsibilities far sooner than expected, and it was about a family transforming private heartbreak into public service. For as long as possible, William's silence had protected his father. When that silence finally ended, it did not weaken the monarchy. It revealed the personal sacrifices required to preserve it. In his final recorded address, William made one promise unmistakably clear. Charles's decision to step back was not an ending. It was a dignified transition, shaped by illness, love, and responsibility. A dignified transition means stepping away from daily duties while continuing to be respected for a lifetime of service. William wanted the public to see not only the king, but the man behind the crown. Charles accepted that reality with the quiet courage that had defined many of his most difficult days. He understood that history might remember his reign less for its length than for the grace with which he faced its greatest challenge. After waiting decades to become king, he accepted that his health could no longer sustain the demands of the role. Rather than allowing bitterness to define his final chapter, he chose trust. He allowed his son to step forward, not as a rival, but as the leader he had quietly prepared all along. For one final family moment, William stood beside his father, not ahead of him, not in his place, but beside him, supporting the crown as Charles gradually released its daily weight. Only then did William fully understand that becoming the monarchy's central figure meant leaving behind the last hope that there would be more time. Catherine watched with quiet pride, while recognizing the grief William carried beneath his composure. Camilla remained close to Charles. The transition had deeply changed her, but she no longer resisted what could not be changed. She chose unity over sorrow. Catherine left knowing honesty had preserved what secrecy never could. Camilla left knowing love could endure even when power shifted. William left knowing duty had become something deeply personal. Charles remained king, but his active chapter as the working head of the monarchy had reached its natural close. No unanswered questions remained, only a new beginning. William's true stewardship of the monarchy had begun, not through celebration, but through responsibility, sacrifice, and love. The monarchy changed forever because one son found the courage to speak the truth when everyone else struggled to find the words. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more royal stories and updates. We'll see you in the next video.